Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alden Gansky, coming to you from a very hot Central California. And I'm the author of about 50 different works, most of them novels, and some nonfiction, about 12 titles or so. My latest is a short nonfiction called Unspoken.
And if you are waiting for Molly to introduce herself, so are we. We are hoping that she'll be able to join us here in a few minutes. I think we might have some technical difficulties. We'll see what's going on, though. Hopefully she'll be able to join us. But I do want to remind those of you listening to our audio-only podcast, again, if you ever have the opportunity and the time to join us at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Tuesday evenings, that's when we do our recording, our live recording, and you can join us in the chat room and ask us live questions and share your 2 cents and correct us when we're wrong, which happens, I don't know if that's ever happened, but you want to be there for that historic occasion when maybe one of us will actually be wrong, so that you can give us a hard time about that. If you are watching on
historic
YouTube,
if we admitted it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. If you are watching on YouTube, we do ask that you'd be kind enough to hit that thumbs up button. Helps us out quite a bit. And don't forget to subscribe. Had a few more subscribers joining us. We're getting close to that magical 100 number, that fantastic 100 subscriber threshold. So would love to have you as part of our subscribers so that you can watch all of our episodes. We got a wild card tonight about writing nonfiction writing for the fiction writer. But before we get there, had a quick Ask the Author question from avid listener. I don't know if I can call him avid, but consistent listener. I don't know if he actually enjoys us, but he tunes in often, which is nice. Bruce Brady, and he's contacted us via aarongansky.com, and he says, do you feel that 3 or 4 point of views in a middle grade novel are too many? And I think that especially since we just finished this whole month focusing on point of view, and that's actually something that I've heard before, is that you shouldn't have multiple perspectives, multiple points of view within a YA book. I'm not sure who's made that rule or why that rule exists. Personally, I don't really like that rule, and I'm not sure why that rule is a rule. Personally, I don't think 3 or 4 points of view is too much for a middle grade novel at all. It might be stretching it if you went to 5 or 6, but I know middle schoolers who are reading Lord of the Rings, and that's a little more challenging than just 3 or 4 points of view. So as long as you're clear with it, I think 3 or 4 is definitely within the realm of reasonability. The thing that I would suggest, Bruce, is that you read some of your favorite middle grade books and find out from which perspective they're told. I feel like the Chronicles of Narnia are often told from at least 2 points of view, if not 3 points of view. You'll see that from Lucy's point of view, and then Edmund's point of view, just in the Chronicles of, just in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It feels like there might be maybe Peter's point of view in there as well, but you get those in there. And so what I would do is I would look for middle grade books that are close to what you're writing in terms of the points of view, etc. Find out who's publishing those, and then you'll get a sense of what publishing houses are comfortable publishing multiple POV middle grade books, and those would be the publishers that you'd want to contact in regards to your book. So for me, I don't think it's a deal breaker. I know it's been kind of a buzz topic lately in the industry, and I'm not sure why. I don't know why it's a big issue, other than some of the biggest names in YA have been doing first-person perspective. And so if you follow that logic, then all YA needs to be first-person present tense. And I disagree with that. So that's just me personally. I think you're fine with that. How about you, Pops?
Yeah, I agree with you, Aaron. I think you've given some good advice there. And it's important, no matter what you're writing, whether you're doing middle school, middle grades, or young adult, adult kinds of books, the longer books and stuff, that you study your genre. You see what the others are doing, because when you go down and you buy a book and you look through it, that author's been probably through several drafts, been through the editing process, had all that kind of advice come their way. So you're getting the end product of really several minds. So I always like to take a look. When I switched over to mysteries for a while, I wanted to read mysteries. If I'm going to do science fiction, I read science fiction. If I'm going to do suspense or supernatural suspense, and that's the kind of stuff that I want to read because I want to see what they're doing. Once I get that figured out, then I can start mine. I would say in this particular case, the only other advice I would give is it'd be great to have at least 2 points of view, one from a boy's point of view and one from the girl's point of view in this. And that just helps the readers have one person they could really relate to. So the girls will relate to the girl and boys to the boys, especially at those ages. And so it becomes more vicarious for them to live through the characters, and it will keep their interest more, and it'll also broaden your readership.
Well said, Pops. So like Pop said, I think if we could just kind of summarize that, I gave you some good advice. I had some good things to say. So I just want to wrap up your little thing there. So, no selfish motives there at all. So this week we are turning our attention from fiction to nonfiction, which seems perhaps counterintuitive for a fiction podcast to cover nonfiction. However, it's a fact of the industry that if you want to write fiction, you'll eventually be writing nonfiction as well. Now, normally that comes across as blog posts on a particular hobby or interest or research topic that you're very interested in, kind of your niche. It might be something more prestigious like an article for something like Writer's Digest. It could just simply be about writing, which is what I do. But like it or not, at some point, you will write nonfiction. You'll need to write nonfiction. We want you to be able to do that well, perhaps even be able to pull some tips and tricks from your fiction writing and pull those into your nonfiction. So we will talk a little bit about that, but we also wanted to honor you, Pops, a little bit. You mentioned very humbly at the beginning of the cast, your newest book is out. This is called Unspoken. You've written 11 nonfiction books and co-wrote 2 others. So you do, in addition to doing blog posts about the craft of writing and imagination and some of the other things that you covered. So you have been well steeped in both fiction and nonfiction. And so who better to talk about the differences between them than you? And so I thought we might talk a little bit about that, the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Is that all right?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Excellent. So we're going to do this kind of as a Q&A. You'll be answering a lot of my questions, and I will, while Molly is away, I'll be monitoring the chat room in case you guys have any additional questions for Pops. You can let us know, and I'll be monitoring that for us. Trying to do as good of a job as Molly Jo. I'm not sure I will, but give it the old college try here. So, Pops, first question. Why is it important that fiction writers know how to write nonfiction? I've already talked a little bit about it, but you might be able to say a little more specifically.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get an erroneous idea of what it means to be a professional writer. Or we sometimes call them working writers. That's where if you don't write and sell, you don't pay your mortgage. So I used to have this vision when I wanted to be a writer that what the writer did was he'd sit around in a smoking jacket. He'd have a number 2 pencil in his hand, or he'd be behind a classic typewriter, maybe at a computer, and there'll be a fire in the fireplace and an Irish setter down by his feet, and just living a life of leisure, and then cranking out page after page of book stuff that's going to make him millions of dollars. And then I became a writer, and I found out none of that's true, and that mostly it's hard work, and it's a variety of work. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more the contemporary writer is that you have to spread yourself out a little bit, especially in the internet age. So most writers will blog. I put up a blog today on novelrocket.com. It's not my blog, it's someone else's, but once a month I write for them. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about a little bit later is a thing called Monroe's Motivational Sequence. I wrote that on that type of outline. So all of that to say is that today publishers want writers who can do a little bit more, can write back cover copy for their own work. They can, because many publishers are doing less and less PR work and publicity. that even press releases, speeches, all those kinds of things, it's just good for a writer to be able to do those things, even though it's not going to be their primary occupation. So we're talking fiction here at first in fiction, but that doesn't mean that at some point you're not going to be asked to write a blog for something, or you may get an idea, as I did for some nonfiction, and find out that you really want to do that and enjoy it too, which is not unusual. You might be surprised how many famous writers started off as and even remained as nonfiction writers. George Orwell, for example, was an essayist, social critic, so he didn't just write fiction. And even I'm thinking of Stephen King, for example, who did Das Macabre, and then he did his writing book, and then he's also has written a lot of nonfiction in the form of articles and the like. So, even the best-selling ones will write other things. And the other thing is, you may find that there's something in there that you love, and it will broaden your outreach. And one other name drop: Isaac Asimov. He preferred to write nonfiction. He made his living, he made his money, and he made his fame writing science fiction novels. But mostly he wanted to write nonfiction, and he always got disgruntled when he had to write another novel. But he did both. He did a lot of both. So I think it goes hand in hand with fiction writers.
Yeah, I'm kind of the opposite way. I get very disgruntled when I have to write nonfiction. But it is kind of a fact, especially if you've got a day job, you will be asked to write nonfiction. As a teacher, I've been cornered by more than one principal. Hey, we've got these WASC reports that are due, and you're a writer, so why don't you write these up for us? Or I've actually served on WASC committees and had to write just these ridiculously massive documents, kind of judging, if that's, I don't know if that's the right term, but evaluating, there we go, evaluating these different schools and the like. I've been approached several times to write grants. Can you write a grant for this particular company or this particular project or this educational thing? And for me, usually my answer is no. If I can say no, I usually do, because I enjoy writing nonfiction about fiction, how to write fiction, but not as enjoyable to cover some of those other topics. That being said, though, it hasn't hurt, as you said, my platform, so to speak. It's made me better at the art of fiction. So some things to consider there. And we know that the primary difference between nonfiction and fiction is simply nonfiction is true. And I'll use the term true. I'll put air quotes around that. Because we could talk about, that's a whole different topic. I did a study on fictional memoirs, but that's a whole different thing. James Frey in A Million Little Pieces. But usually nonfiction, true, fiction, not true. So can you explain a little bit more, though, about the differences between the two types of writing?
Sure. Let me add, though, to what you were saying there, and that is, I made part of my living writing nonfiction, so it would free me up to do fiction. So I used to write corporate videos, advertising copy. I did a lot of business kinds of writing, and I would get paid for that, and it's usually short writing. Somebody says, I need a television ad. Okay, I'll do that for you. I'll crank one of those out, or a radio ad, and I'll crank one of those out. And it was fairly quick money, and that freed me up to work on the Heart's Desire, which was the novel at the time. Even though it ate up some time, it made sure there was pizza money for the kids when they needed pizza. So I did quite a bit of that. Okay, so the difference between nonfiction and fiction. Fiction primarily is entertainment. Now, we may want to convey truth. We may want to present things. Charles Dickens did that, of course. He's talking about child labor in England. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Abraham Lincoln said, was the book that started the Civil War. So fiction can carry a lot of truth in it. And what it does is it exemplifies, it shows, it allows the reader to explore. Nonfiction is usually meant to be persuasive or educational or to explain something. That's not to mean that it lacks the same kind of quality as fiction. I don't believe that some of the best books I've read are nonfiction books by very skilled writers. But those are the basic differences. Now, you can put a lot of fiction writing into nonfiction, that is fiction writing skills. And I've mentioned this book before, but I'm going to mention it again. It's Day One by Peter Wyden. It was written 30 years ago. So I don't know whether to encourage you to read it or not. It's fascinating and depressing all at the same time. And I'll probably read a little bit from just one paragraph a little bit later. But his skill level was such that he's writing a nonfiction book about the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the Japanese portion of World War II. He did it with such skill that it was like reading a novel. And it had that same entertainment, maybe I should say same engaging factor to it that we all strive for when we do our novels. We want to engage the reader in the story, let them suspend a disbelief. Well, you don't have to suspend your disbelief in a book like that, but you still want to engage the reader. So that's one of the differences. In both cases, writers want to leave an image. They want to get their ideas into the heads of the reader. They want to leave their fingerprints on the reader's brain. So the goals are pretty much the same. It's just whether or not you want to be primarily educational or if you want to be edifying. Educational or entertainment is what I'm trying to say. Do you want to be primarily educational? Or do you want to be primarily entertaining? And that's really the difference, even though fiction, of course, can be kind of rough on the heart and the mind, and it can be very socially aware. So they cross over quite a bit.
And especially in the realm of research, a lot of fiction is based in solid research, and you get some good information from fiction as well. And fiction can impact you emotionally, which is not always the purpose of nonfiction, but it certainly can be. Testa Groot just actually mentioned in the chat room creative nonfiction. And a lot of people say, isn't that an oxymoron? That's what they said at Antioch, and people laughed, and then people got punched in the nose, and it was ugly. But one of the best writers I know does creative nonfiction. He writes essays, and they're phenomenal, just phenomenal. He wrote one about Star Trek, which only helped his credibility in my book. Still, one of the best things I've written, regardless of genre. I have a copy of the essay, and I have my students read it and analyze it. I think it's super powerful, and it's an essay. And nonfiction can be every bit as powerful as fiction. But then you get this idea of this creative nonfiction. Specifically, I'm thinking of books here like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood or Stone's The Origin, which are nonfiction, but they read a lot more like novels. And so did you have a particular take on that, Pops?
Yeah, that became very popular a number of years ago. It picked up a name. It was called New Journalism. And that's where you take a factual story, a real event, but you tell it as though it's a fictional story. So there's more dialogue. The scene setting is richer. The language is smoother. It's meant to be more emotional at times. And Truman Capote did that in Cold Blood, and it's what made him famous. And then Stone's The Origin is about Charles Darwin and his journey on the HMS Beagle. And that was a fascinating story because it was written as though it were a novel, but every key event in there was factual. So he might make up some dialogue to transition from one thing to another, but always kept it in keeping with what Charles Darwin would have probably said or maybe said later. So that became very popular. Still goes on, though you don't see the phrase new journalism much anymore. It's just sensory-rich nonfiction writing, and it can be incredibly, incredibly moving. You mentioned Tess. She talked about reading the book Hiroshima, and when she was in Japan, she had to go see the city where that event took place. And some of it does not go away. So I read some nonfiction that has stayed with me for decades, and I may never get rid of it. It's been that powerful.
I agree. It can have some pretty life impacting goals there. If we have time, I'd love to talk about the intersection between fiction and nonfiction, specifically in fictional memoirs, but only if we have time at the end of the episode. If not, you'll just have to live in wonder or email me. Anyhow, there are some novels that are created. We talked about this a little bit earlier, that are created from nonfiction sources. They use them like research, like Thomas Wolfe's The Right Stuff. It's been called like a nonfiction novel, which seems somewhat paradoxical. But what about that kind of a genre? Is that something that that our listeners should know about?
Yeah, and as you mentioned that, I just suddenly flashed on James Michener's Space, which is clearly a novel, but it's rooted in fact. So some of the names and stuff are changed, and which would touch on the book I was writing, Inherit the Wind, which is rooted in the Scopes trial, although it portrays it inaccurately. But their argument is it's fiction. But there are things like The Right Stuff. Thomas Wolfe was a nonfiction writer. He wrote for Rolling Stone and other places. So he was a journalist. He began interviewing test pilots and those going into the early space age. And from that, he wrote a book, but he did it in this new journalism format where it reads like a novel, and it has plenty of dialogue in it, and those kinds of things, and emotions and getting into people's heads and that sort of thing. But technically, it's a nonfiction book. So, yeah, it really blurs the line. It really blurs the line. So what you probably, if you were in grad school or something like that, you wouldn't source The Right Stuff other than to mention that it was very famous and a movie was made from it, or that it was well written, but you wouldn't use it as a source in, say, a thesis or a dissertation. Even though the facts are there, it'd be just hard to cite that, I think, and have it accepted. But it definitely reads like a novel. If you want to see that, one of the best things you can do is go to books.google.com. If you don't want to buy the thing, and you'll get to see some pages of it, or you can go to Amazon.com and they let you look inside the book, even though it's an older book, and you can just read the first chapter, and you'll see that it reads very much like a novel. There's tension, there's dialogue. It starts off fast. Everything you'd want in a novel.
Good stuff. Now, why is it that nonfiction is important to the fiction writer?
Well, we've mentioned that contemporary writers are expected to help promote their work more and more today. The publishers just don't promote authors like they used to unless you're a bestseller. This is one of the, would you call this irony? That the writers who get the most publicity are the ones who need it the least. Mm-hmm. But more money will be spent on promoting their books because they know they can sell a lot of them, so they're going to get a return, and not on little-known authors. And see, all of that has changed. Probably we've got to do a show sometimes on what's changed in publishing in the last 25 or 30 years. Back in the days of Maxwell Perkins, he's bringing people up. He's not expecting them to be famous. He's making them famous. So he brings in Hemingway. He brings in Fitzgerald. He brings in some of these others. Wolfe. They just did a movie based on the book about Max Perkins. North Carolina. I can't think of the guy's first name, Wolfe. I can remember his last name. But anyway, it'll come to me a little bit later. I'm old, so I've got an excuse. That's what it used to be. Today, you're going to have to do a lot of your own promotion, which might mean writing an article that's similar to what your book is about, to writing press releases, any number of things. So it's important, I think, for the contemporary writer to know how to write nonfiction. Also, I think when fiction writers write nonfiction, they become better novelists. They become better fiction writers. And most people forget this. When you think of Mark Twain, what book do you think of? Probably a couple come to mind. Yep, Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer. Those are his novels. Those are not his best-selling books. His best-selling book is a nonfiction travel book. Innocents Abroad. Of course, he told it with a lot of humor and stuff, so it's very entertaining. But Mark Twain started off as a journalist and an essayist before he turned to writing fiction. So many novelists get their start first in journalism. So they start by writing nonfiction, then they find that they have a flair for fiction, and they move into that. So that's certainly true with Mark Twain, and they went on to become what we would call a platform speaker today. That is, he traveled around giving speeches. That's how he sold his books, because he was out doing the promotion.
Absolutely. I guess he's okay, Mark Twain. He sold a couple of books, I think.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, if you need somebody to look up to, I guess Mark Twain's fine. So now for the real question here. What types of fiction techniques can we put to use in our nonfiction? So we're fiction writers. What types of things are we already doing that we can use in our nonfiction writing to make it better?
A lot of things. Scene setting, for one. Let me read this from Day One, the book I mentioned earlier. And he starts off like this. These are the first lines of the book. Now, remember, this is a nonfiction book about the creation of the atomic bomb and the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so Wyden starts this way. He says, "The night was dark, the weather threatening. Standing tersely at the end of the runway, Dr. Norman F. Ramsey, a physicist from Columbia University, had watched the B-29 roar at him and lumber into the air as it edged towards the blackness of the Pacific." Now, see, he's using visuals to get this across. He could have said that Dr. Norman F. Ramsey, a physicist from Columbia University, watched as the B-29 took off from the runway and headed out over the Pacific Ocean. And that would have been fine in some nonfiction books, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to give you a feel for the man, the setting. So he starts off with, almost it's a dark and stormy night, but the night was dark, the weather threatening, and then we see the action going on. So even though he's writing straight nonfiction, he is using a fiction writer's skill at setting the scene so that we'll understand it a little bit better. The second thing we can do is the setting of the milieu, that is where the action is taking place, and the events that you're talking about. So at the risk of feeling or coming across as arrogant, let me read to you from my book Unspoken, which is about the Thomas Scopes monkey trial. I never like to call it the monkey trial, but that's what we remember it, in Dayton, Tennessee, and the speech that William Jennings Bryan was not allowed to deliver, hence Unspoken. And so I started off this way. The Tennessee summer of 1925 was stifling. Still, hundreds of people of Dayton, Tennessee, and nearby regions came dressed in suits and dresses to stand along the rails where a Southern Railway train waited. Men, several in Navy uniforms, carried a bronze coffin to the back of the last car and helped load a passenger well known to the entire country. And in the coffin is William Jennings Bryan. He died 5 days after the trial. Now, I could have just said that he died 5 days after the trial and he was loaded on this train and given a long ride back to where he would be buried. But it was more important for me to show these people are turning out in the horrible heat, and they're wearing suits and hats. They're putting on their best for this man that they loved who died in their midst with that. So able to set the milieu that these people would do that kind of thing. And then I went on in the book and talk a little bit about the Andy of Mayberry feel of Dayton and that sort of thing. So though it's a nonfiction book, I'm trying to set things up that way. Another thing, we can give new life to characters, subjects. From my book, 30 Events That Shaped the Church, I talk about Martin Luther. Used to be Luther, but his name was changed to Martin Luther. And I start off the chapter with, for much of his life, Martin Luther was a miserable man. Guilt and fear overshadowed him. No matter how long he confessed, and at times he could confess for up to 6 hours, he never found peace for his soul. And a lot of people don't know that about Martin Luther. They see him as a great reformer, but they don't realize that he was prone to depression. He was abused as a child, and he never felt worthy of God's love. And once he was told to just simply love God, he said, "Love God, I hate God." Well, this is before he had his transformation, but I wanted to get that across. So far, so good? Still with me there, Aaron?
So far, so good.
All right.
Absolutely.
Wyden does something again in day one. So I come back to that. I'm not going to read anything this time, but I'm just going to share one of the things he did is he gives us, and this was what was so soul shredding, is he gives us a view of what happened on the ground when the bombs were dropped. And the surviving the initial bomb blasts and how they're looking for family and how several men are carrying the portrait of the emperor on burned backs and stuff like that. And he goes into great detail, talks about what the children looking for their parents and bodies in the river that run through it. And, by the time you're done with that, you've done a good week's worth of work in just an hour of reading. But it's because he made it real. It wasn't cut and dry. It was very emotive, heart-tugging, put a tear in your eye kind of thing. And now I read this book 30 years ago, and I've not read it since. I still have it. I have it right here. For those that are watching on video, I have it right here, day one. Great book. Just a very tough read for me since I'm, one of those sensitive guys. So unless you're writing an academic book for some academic publisher, you can engage your storytelling skills right in the nonfiction.
I agree, and you make some good points there. Developing character, developing action, developing setting, and the emotive writing, all very fiction, geared toward fiction writers, and we can pull that in, and that helps to allow events that have transpired years ago, decades ago, over a half a century ago, still feel real to us now. And that's a powerful thing. But you also say, unless you're writing an academic book for an academic publisher, and I want to make sure that even in academic writing, you can engage your storytelling skills. You don't want to go overboard, though, because that's definitely a different skill set. And that's academic writing is definitely more informative for sure. But I remember in writing firsts in fiction, Pops, one of the things, I had you read it before I sent it off to the publisher, and one of the things that you said was that it sounded too academic. And so you have to be aware of your audience. Who do you want to read this? Do you want just historical buffs reading day one, or are you trying to open it up to a wider audience? I obviously wanted writers to read my book, but I was speaking in an academic register that was pretty far removed from what the normal reader likes. It's not what they would normally pick up to read. And so matching your voice to the expectations of your audience, I think, is a big deal. And you have to be, I would say, Pops, see if you agree with this, you have to be even more aware of your audience when writing nonfiction than you do when you're writing your fiction, because fiction will cover a wide swath of people, but nonfiction is usually geared toward a very specific audience. Would you agree with that?
I would. Just like when we write novels and short stories, we usually have someone in mind who is our reader. And some writers go to the great extent of naming them, and that's who they're writing for, that person. It's certainly true in nonfiction. Now, with real academic stuff, there's a certain standard you have to live up to. So for those who have ever written a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation with that, there's certain things you have to do. And if you get close to the fiction side, they consider you unprofessional. And the only people who are going to read it are those who understand your discipline of study. But if you're writing for the general population, then you don't want to sound too academic. And that was hard for me when I did my very first nonfiction book-length nonfiction. When I did that, I was like 3 chapters in, and when I realized what I was doing was I was not writing a nonfiction book for the everyman. What I was doing is writing a really long term paper. And I ultimately threw them out. I just started over. I thought, I've just got this all wrong. I messed up with this. Took a more casual approach, started doing fiction stuff with it. And that's often what publishers look for. Baker, I did a couple books with them, and that's what they wanted. They wanted the fiction style in nonfiction books. And I think it's really the best way to work. And it's really just communication. And I don't always know why we may have to make these distinction. It's communication. So when you write a nonfiction book, you're not likely to make up dialogue. When you write, unless you're doing new journalism, you're not likely to make up dialogue. But with a novel, you can make up dialogue and get things across. So I'll remind you of Jack Kavanaugh, who did a whole series of historical books that start from the Puritans and move on into contemporary times. And at the end of every book and an afterward, he would have this section that tell you what events were true and what he used to further the story that there's no historical record for, just so you'd be clear on it. So, you know, if there was a meeting of two people, he would say, I made that up. Since it was done in a novel, and some people will just take that as gospel since it's in a book.
And yeah, true. And you want to be cautious with that. You definitely want to make sure that you are being honest with your reader. One of the reasons James Frey took such a hit to his, well, aside from him just being kind of a jerk, to his reputation, is when it came out that his memoir, A Million Little Pieces, was largely fabricated. It was probably 90% fiction and 10% fact. People became very angry and upset with him. And it wasn't necessarily because they disliked the book. It was because they were led to believe that he was being honest with them and telling them, you know, this true story. And he had embellished it beyond the point of recognition. And it became something else entirely. So they were not necessarily upset by the content of the book, but more about the way the book was marketed. Interestingly enough, you could write a memoir, call it fiction, and people would be okay with it. But writing fiction and calling it a memoir, then people get upset. And so there's a contract, what we would call a social contract between reader and author, that if you are publicizing your book as nonfiction, it better be nonfiction, and you better be getting the facts right. Or otherwise, you should be doing something like an afterword to say, these are the parts that were fictionalized, these parts actually happened, so that you can kind of clarify that. Well said, Pops. Good things there. Yeah. Now, this is perhaps the most important question on our show tonight. How do you plan, if you're writing nonfiction? Do you outline? Do you not outline? I'm a discovery writer, but I know for me, when I write nonfiction, I have to outline. Is that kind of the same thing for you?
Yeah, I'm, though, like you, I'm mostly a discovery writer, an intuitive writer. When I do fiction, sometimes I outline, sometimes I don't. With nonfiction, you almost always have to outline. Fortunately, it's a lot easier to do that. And so you know what chapter you're going to have. You say, okay, what key points do I want to make? And those become your subheads. Then you fill some things in. And do you need an illustration to be the kind of book you're talking about? Do you need an anecdote? Do you? We're going to do some quotes here. And you just kind of plug them in, and then you smooth it out, and then apply your fiction skills to make it really ring. There is, and I learned this a long time ago in college. It's probably one of the best things I've ever learned, because I have used it in many things, and it's called Monroe's Motivational Sequence. Now, don't let that throw you. It's from a speech book, and there's several authors. Monroe's the first one. That's why he gets credit for it. Monroe's Motivational Sequence, and the initial writing of the book was paid for, I believe, by the Army. They wanted to teach their officers to be able to give better speeches and the like. So what I'm going to share with you is really a very useful speech outline, but it is also one of the most useful outlines for things in nonfiction. And I have used this outline for blog posts. I did one today, as I said earlier, for novelrocket.com. You go there. And if you read the article, it will be based on these 5 steps I'm going to share with you quickly. But I've done that, and I've done video scripts, advertising copy, chapters in nonfiction books. I've done it that way. It's amazingly versatile, even though it's primarily for speakers, public speakers. So let me share these with you. It comes in 5 steps, and then I'm going to give you a 30-second speech to show you how it works. It can be that brief. Again, I've written radio ads based on these. Here's what Monroe found out. This is mostly for motivation, but you can use it for entertainment and the like. And he summarized it in 5 steps. Step number 1 is attention step. And what you want to do there is you want to get the reader's attention, or if you're giving a speech, you want to get the listener's attention. And it can be a vivid description, an anecdote, anything that pulls the audience and the reader in so they'll start listening to you. And it's usually a very short step. That's followed by a need step. And all of this will be in the show notes. So you can read it there. The need step, and that just simply describes what the reader needs to know, or if you're giving the speech, what the listener needs to know, or feels or worries about. So you get their attention. You say, okay, here's a need that we have. The satisfaction step, here's what you can do about it. And the next step after satisfaction step is visualization step. This is what it looks like if you'll do this. And then there's the action step, which is an appeal to respond, do something about it. Now, if you're doing a chapter in a book, you usually, well, you can begin with an anecdote. You show what the problem is that, say, if it's an individual's life or whatever's happening at that point in the nonfiction book. So that'd be the need step. The satisfaction step is what can be done about it. Visualization step, this is what it looks like. Action step, this is what you need to do. So let me give you a 30-second speech based on Monroe's motivational sequence. Are you ready? Say yes.
Yes.
All right. Just want to make sure you're still here.
Still here. I was commenting in the room.
Let's pretend that I'm running for the local school board and I'm about to give a speech. And here's a 30-second speech. Can you run for president? Your mom told me a joke today. She said, is your refrigerator running? If so, I might vote for it.
Nice.
Yeah, a lot of people not real happy with things either way. So it would go something like this. I was walking down the street the other day, and I was passing to school when I saw a little girl, and she was standing on the sidewalk and crying. So I stopped and I asked her, little girl, why are you crying? That's the attention step. She said, and this is the need step, she said, I'm afraid to go to school. So I asked, why are you afraid to go to school? She goes, when I go to school, they have guns and knives, and they took a gun away from a kid in my room just yesterday. So that's the need step. So the satisfaction step is this. That's when I decided to run for school board. Our kids should not be frightened to go to school. There should be no more fear. I plan to do something about it. Visualization step is next. When you vote for me, I will give all my energies to making our schools safe again. Action step, I can't do it by myself. I need your vote. Please vote for me. And that's it, 30 seconds of motivation. So attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. So in the blog I did, though, I just started with a simple statement to get people interested. And then I talked about how to get old books for research or just to collect. I told them how to do that, where to go, and I gave 3 places where they could get out-of-print books, visualize what they could do with it as writers, and then the action step was for them to do something about it. So that is Monroe's motivational sequence.
Alton Gansky for President of the United States. I may just write you in, Pops. Let me see if I can do that. Let's see how easy this is. I have not rehearsed this. This is not on the show notes. I might fail miserably, but Pops, at least you can point out the flaws in what I'm doing here. And perhaps our listeners can learn something from this. But I typically, my niche is writing about fiction or writing fiction. So I would pick something like how to avoid a cliche. And so my attention step might say something like, we've all found cliches in our writing. I don't know, that's not a very good attention step. I'd find something catchier like cliches are as old as the hills.
Yeah.
It's something a little more ironic, perhaps. Then the need step, cliches sneak into our writing and they murder what good work we've done so far. Good writing needs to be free from cliches. So that's kind of the need step. Satisfaction. By following these simple steps, and I would provide the steps, you can avoid putting cliches into your writing. Visualization, your writing will be rich and original and vivid, blah, blah, blah. And action step, when next you're writing, find 3 cliches to eliminate.
Or I would just end it by saying, get your red pen out.
Okay. That's a lot more eloquent and well said. So, man, I hope I didn't embarrass myself too much. But
no, that was right on. You got all of those different things, and that's you started with humor, which is fine in a speech. Usually in nonfiction books, you'd probably use an anecdote or some issue, but other than that, see, that was fine. There's like you said, we should avoid cliches like the plague would be a good way to start, but most of us don't. And then maybe throw in a couple more cliches if you're writing, let's say, an article or something like that, and then get into the need. And yeah, that'd have been perfect.
It may not be a bad topic for a wild card. I'll put that in our list of wildcard topics. So something we can maybe do with that. But one of the things that I want to make sure that our listeners hear is that the nonfiction that you're writing, I think, still needs to come from your heart, still needs to come from you, as much as your fiction does. There's nothing worse than writing soul-eating WASP reports, because it's generally not about you. Now, some people really enjoy them. They love it, and they are just so into educational academia, like they eat that stuff up. And if that's your thing, that's what you write about. It is not my thing. Writing is my thing. And so the subject matter has to be important and relevant to you. And you want to find a niche. You want to find something that you're good at, something that you've got experience with, something that you've got a credible opinion on, to talk about and to inform your readers with. And so my question for you, Pops, is this book Unspoken, you've mentioned it's about William Jennings Bryan. What is it specifically about this topic that drew you in? How is that part of your niche?
Well, I was writing a book for Baker Publishing, and it was called 30 Events That Shaped the Church. I had written 60 people who shaped the church, and I looked at 60 different people and the impact, both good and bad. There were the horrible people and there were the good people, but they all had some kind of impact on the church. And for those new to the first time listening or new to our program here, I used to be a minister. Did that for about 22 years, and that's why I did a lot of church writing stuff. So as I was doing 30 events, I started at the very beginning of the church, so I go back to the first century, and then I work my way through. When I got to the early 20th century, I asked myself, okay, what key event happened in the early part of the 20th century? And it hit me that the Scopes trial was probably one of the most famous things. It's the most famous trial in the world, even though it was a misdemeanor. It was the first trial to be broadcast over the United States, and enough words were written about the trial and sent overseas that if you bound them in 300-page books, it would fill up 3,000 books. There was just that much. It was that exciting. Well, it's really indicative of what was changing in the United States and in the world. So all of that was very interesting to me. As I did my research, I got very interested in how things happen there. And it turned out that the more research I did, the more I realized that everyone who talks about this has it wrong. They hadn't read the trial transcripts. They mostly what they did is watch the well done, well written movie Inherit the Wind, which is based on the Scopes trial, but is in no way accurate. And they did a great disservice. And the guy who took the beating was William Jennings Bryan. And even to this day, occasionally you'll read things that, well, William Jennings Bryan wasn't all that bright. He wasn't a thinker. Well, he wrote scores of books. He was a magazine editor. He's one of the greatest orators our country has ever seen. And if you pick up a book on great speeches, you'll always see his name in there. He was actually very brilliant, but in a dying art, oration. Well, anyway, he took quite a beating, and I got a little more interested in that, so I began to do some more research. Well, that book came out, and for some reason I couldn't let go of it. This is one of those things that grip you and say you're going to write this. So I've been writing short works on the Scopes trial. In this particular book, Unspoken, which is about the closing speech that William Jennings Bryan never got to deliver, is very short. It's like 120 pages or something. I did that for two reasons. One, that's about all the book was going to handle. And two, the speech was published in 1925 after he died. He just finished checking the galleys, and he died that day. He came home, had a big meal, took a nap, and died. Makes me very nervous to take naps now. It was kind of unexpected, though. He'd had diabetes almost of his life, and it killed his father too, so it wasn't totally unexpected. nonetheless, I wanted to take a close look at that because it would reveal more of who he is, the way he thought, and what he really believed, which is often misrepresented. So I did some preliminary work on the stuff. Here's what happened at the Scopes trial. That's why the book's important, that sort of thing. Then I took his speech and I went through it line by line and made comments so people could understand it a little bit better. So that was the subject matter. It's just one segment, one slice of the pie of the Scopes trial, but I found it interesting. I knew no publisher was going to pick it up because, one, it's too short and it's probably a little too focused. So I self-published it. It was something I wanted to do, and it may not sell a lot, I don't know, but it filled a hole in my life to be able to do that.
Fascinating, really, and I've read it, or at least an early manuscript of it. Very intriguing stuff. Not my cup of tea. Normally, I'm not kind of the legal guy, but the trial itself is really fascinating. It almost reads. I don't want to equate it to a John Grisham novel because it's not a novel, but the trial itself was so fascinating with the turns that it took. Really intriguing stuff, and of course, the speech by William Jennings Bryan is very powerful as well. So, Dave Fessenden asks an interesting question, Pops. He says, isn't there a simplified version of Monroe's sequence called something like hey, here, how, see, go? Something like that, where hey would be the attention, here would be the, what was the second step? The need, how would be the satisfaction,
visualization,
see, visualization, and goes, action.
There could be. I've not.
Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't. I haven't heard that. But if Dave says it, then it's just got to be true.
Well, then it's gold. It's gold.
It's golden.
So, it's absolutely golden. We're a little bit short on time here, but I'd shared with the room some things about fictional memoirs and doing some research on that. Some really fascinating things. My favorite was the woman who wrote a memoir about being raised by wolves in the Black Forest of Germany, which apparently was never fact-checked. Point, did somebody say, really? Raised by wolves, huh? That's that happened to you? Like, nobody went out and interviewed any of the wolves, which I think would be your first stop, right? And just didn't interview the wolves, which I think is just a colossal shortcoming of the publisher. They should have interviewed those wolves for sure. But there's that. We had a couple of other questions here that we've got a couple minutes. You want to run through these real fast, Pops?
Sure.
These came from Molly. Just real quick, she says, do you prefer writing fiction or nonfiction?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The way my brain is wired, I usually prefer to write whatever it is I'm not working on. So if I'm working on a novel, I really want to write some nonfiction. And when I'm writing nonfiction, I keep thinking about novels. We always want what we don't have. Because you start thinking that it's easier. Oh, it's much easier to write nonfiction. Well, it's not. But when you're writing nonfiction, because, oh, writing novels is so much easier. Well, it's not. Then once you get back into it, you're reminded of that. I don't know. Lately, I've been thinking more about nonfiction than I ever have. But just as I say that, and I think, well, maybe I'll just write nonfiction from now on. I won't do any more novels. 2 novel ideas come up and start pestering me day and night. So we'll probably be doing that. And of course, I'm still writing fiction with the Harbinger series. I'll be starting my next one of those pretty soon. So yeah, I don't know that I have a preference.
Yeah, I would say fiction, but then when I'm writing about writing fiction, I also enjoy that. But I feel like fiction is where my heart is. So for me, it's a little bit easier, but I also haven't written as many nonfiction books as you have. So it's hard for me to make a kind of a qualified answer there. But she also wants to know what your favorite part of writing Unspoken was and what you hope your readers will take away from it.
Well, I think one of the things I really enjoyed was not just the courtroom antics, and there were plenty of them. We have a tendency to think of it in 21st century terms. It was 1925, so things were going on that you couldn't do in court today. Judge Rawlston, for example, always began the trial with prayer, and there sits Clarence Darrow, an admitted agnostic, and he just kept stewing and stewing about it, and then finally he does something that gets him in danger of being in contempt of court, and so he apologizes to the court, to the judge, for losing his temper, so he won't go to jail, and then he has to sit through what amounts to about 15 or 20 minutes of sermon from the judge. It's hilarious, and he has to sit there and he has to take it. But one of the other things was early 1920s were pivotal for the United States. Everything was changing. We were going from Gibson girls with their big dresses and the long hair piled up on top of their head and covered from neck to ankle, to flappers, who bound their chests, so they would look flat-chested, and they wore tight-fitting and flapper dresses and, skull caps, and breaking prohibition laws. And because World War II ended, everybody just went nuts with that. Well, that was changing. Schools were changing. More people were going to school. More people were going to college. And there was lots of debate about whether or not sex education should be taught in school. So everything was changing right there in those first few years. So that in itself was fascinating for me. Now, what do I want the reader to take from it? That great things have gone on in the past, even though they're often forgotten, and don't believe everything you see in movies.
It's a good lesson. It's good. Well, I just watched Star Trek Beyond. Are you going to tell me that's not true? You're going to tell me
every bit of that's true. Yeah. No,
okay.
That's
solid. That's solid. So
solid, man.
That is solid. That's not a 1920s term, but that is the time that we have for today. Some good stuff, Pops. Thank you for sharing with us. And again, guys, do yourselves a favor. Go out, pick up Unspoken. You can get it on Amazon, correct, Pops? Best place
it's
to get
on
it?
Amazon. It's in iBooks now. I have not been able to find it on Barnes & Noble yet, and Smashwords. It's there, and you can buy the physical book through Amazon or through CreateSpace. And again, it's a tiny little book. It's pretty thin. It's a great sleep aid.
It's a quick read. It is a quick read. It goes fast, and it is really intriguing, especially your commentary on it, which gives a lot more historical context to a lot of what's going on. And so that's good. If I can read it, since it's completely out of my genre, if I can read it and enjoy it, you guys can too. It's really fascinating stuff. So make sure that you pick that up. Next week is another month. We'll be in August already, which means back to school. So we are going to be talking about setting next month. Specifically next week, we'll be talking about time, setting your world in context of time and how to do that. Don't forget to ask the author, which you can do by emailing firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com or contacting me through aarongansky.com. You can find Pops at altongansky.com. You can find Molly Jo, if she's around, at franklymydearmojo.com. And you can find me at aarongansky.com. So we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.